Evening all, lovely people, fellow travellers. Welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, on radio and online. Tonight we'll be picking up again on a story I've looked at previously, which is to say the Scottish COVID inquiry, and eye-watering and breathtaking the testimony is too. Were do not resuscitate orders handed out during the pandemic unnecessarily? Or did everyone do exactly what they had to do in order to make sure COVID was contained as quickly as possible? All of that and more coming up. It was cold in Scotland this week, bitterly so. There was snow on the hills in the month of June. This is not unusual as it happens, but still you feel it. Makes a person waken up and pay attention. The weathermen said that cold wind blew down from the Arctic. It made me think about the so-called climate crisis, the crisis the authorities and their lackeys keep squeaking about, the one we're told is all our fault on account of the cows and our gas boilers, that we're to blame for it, that crisis they used to call global warming. Despite the snow in Scotland, there were headlines about it having been the hottest May on record here in the UK. Record temperatures, apparently. So there you have it. Get told one thing, but see with your own eyes and therefore actually know something else entirely. While you're at it, ask the gardeners about the weather and the climate in Scotland, in Britain. Ask the farmers as well if you want to know what the weather has really been like. So I was thinking about how it was bitterly cold with snow on the ground in June, when at the same time we're being told by officialdom that what we're really experiencing is record high temperatures, a world at boiling point. All of it made me notice for the umpteenth time how we're routinely told one thing when what we feel, what we actually experience is the opposite. And then I saw a headline in the Daily Telegraph. It read, COVID vaccines may have helped fuel rise in excess deaths. COVID jabs and excess deaths linked in the same sentence in an establishment rag after all these years. After all these years when to say as much was to invite censorship at least. After all these years of so many of us knowing there could be something wrong with those jabs, having read independent data on the subject, for example. All the time, the establishment and the scientists and the media smeared anyone saying no to those experimental gene therapies was a dangerous granny-killing loon, apparently. Those COVID jabs are still available. Of course they are. For the elderly, for the young. And then came that headline. Not the one about snow in June, the one about COVID jabs and excess deaths. There was more news from the Scottish COVID inquiry last week as well, including testimony from Age Scotland, a national charity for the over 50s, about countless people being contacted by their GPs to see if they would accept DNA CPR orders, which is to say, do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Which is to say thousands of people were being asked by our NHS to accept that if they were to get ill, they should not expect paramedics or anyone else to help them. If their heart stopped or if they stopped breathing, was it okay with them if nothing was done to get their hearts going again or to get them breathing? The examples offered by the director of Age Scotland were chilling, he said. I would say as chilling as the wind that blew in Scotland this week. A 101-year-old war veteran from Glasgow who had a knock at the door and opened it to find an official handing him a piece of paper telling him to keep it by his bed. When his daughter found it later, by chance, she saw it was a DNA CPR, that her father was hard of hearing, and since that might make it hard for medics to communicate with him, it would be better if he just accepted the inevitable. All the time we were told it was about saving Granny. Or the 50-something woman, Fit, a runner who was contacted by her GP surgery to ask, since she too had hearing loss, if she would accept a DNA CPR. I'm certainly not having a go at Scotland here, far less the Scottish COVID inquiry. On the contrary, fair play to that inquiry for doing what no other equivalent has done, which is listening to the truth of the horror story that played out when the madness was fully in control. There was testimony too about care homes applying DNA CPR notes to every resident in their care without consent, a blanket decision taken to write people off. You might say sentencing them to death, even before any of them were ill. These were people locked in, many extremely distressed and vulnerable almost by definition. I say again, remember all the guff about how people from oldest to youngest, from centenarians to newborn babies, not forgetting pregnant women, had a duty to take those products in order not to kill Granny. Remember that? All the propaganda about the unjabbed being granny killers in the making. I would say the testimony from the Scottish COVID inquiry, and let's accept it lightly, provides a glimpse of the picture across the rest of the UK. We just haven't heard the rest of it yet. I would say the reality laid bare by that inquiry suggests the authorities, more accurately, might as well have been saying, don't kill Granny, because that's our job. I say a cold wind has blown throughout the land, that it started in 2020 and that it's been blowing ever since. I read that headline in the Daily Telegraph, disgracefully long overdue, and know it comes as late as snow in Scotland in June. The same team that pushed the nonsense about COVID, about the jabs, about the need to lock down the entire country for months on end, to cover every face with a paper mask, to follow magic arrows on the floor tiles of shops, to stay 6 feet apart, the rule of 6 or of 9 at funerals, all of it. It's now clear the same team went on to spout nonsense about everything else, insisting the war in support of Ukraine was a war to defend democracy, when there is no democracy in Ukraine and all that's being defended is the money-making potential of the already rich. Telling us wind farms, solar panels and electric cars are green, saving the planet, when all of the above require the wholesale pillage of irreplaceable ecosystems in pursuit of rare earth elements, much of the work done by child slaves to make giant turbines that can't be recycled and must be buried in the soil at the end of their 20-year lifespans, along with the defunct solar panels full of toxic lead and cadmium, all of it certain to leak poison into the land and then the groundwater. None of it seems green to me. All of it looks, on the contrary, only about greed. More and more of us are aware of all this and talking about it. More and more of us have seen that whatever it is we're told about COVID, about war, about the climate, it looks like the opposite to us. Even as the truth of the so-called vaccines bubbles to the surface, the World Health Organization relentlessly pursues the globalist dream of overriding national sovereignty and putting all the most important decision-making regarding our lives into the hands of an unelected, unaccountable cabal. It's also obvious now, the falsehoods, the offering to us of a false narrative with false flags for good measure. By now their bluff seems to run along the lines of hoping we just accept that while the mask has slipped and we know and they know we know, they're hoping to tough it out by shrugging as if to say, what are you lot going to do about it anyway? Those totalitarians have long since seen to it that they have it all. The money in private, secretive, unaccountable hands, the judiciaries, the mainstream media, the police, the civil servants, not to mention all the guns and all the drones. They've persuaded themselves that it simply doesn't matter what the hoi polloi think, far less say. It's the 80th anniversary of D-Day, when the thousands died seeking to gain a toehold on a European continent usurped by Nazis. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau dared to cast his shadow on Juno Beach, a graveyard of heroes, while he spoke about democracy under threat. Quote, "Our way of life didn't happen by accident," he invited himself to say, "and it won't continue without effort." This is the same Justin Trudeau who welcomed an actual Nazi, a veteran of the Waffen-SS, into the Canadian Parliament and joined every other parliamentarian in the room in giving him a standing ovation after hearing that same Nazi celebrated for his efforts to fight the Russians in World War II, the same Russians who were Canada's allies, all our allies, against Nazis. Don't forget, Trudeau is also on record describing those who challenged vaccine mandates or otherwise demanded the return of their freedom as racists, misogynists and right-wing extremists, seizing bank accounts in the process. And then this week I swallowed down more of my own gorge while supposedly British politicians like Sunak, Starmer, Mordaunt and others offered empty platitudes about sacrifice and defending Britain. More of the same politicians that have presided over a Britain without meaningfully defended borders, where our children are taught in school that British history is shameful history, that it's the history of imperialism and colonialism and endemic racism, where anything and everything from maths to the countryside is racist. Those politicians and others like them are from a class or perhaps an ideological clique that is embarrassed by what Britain has always been, embarrassed by the very sight of the British flag, a clique that stands by while patriots profess allegiance to that self-same Britain that the D-Day veterans and the D-Day dead fought and died to defend. They say one thing, that political class, that self-important hollow clique, in the run-up to yet another of the pantomimes we call general elections, while by their actions or inaction they see to it that anyone with a sense of place, of heritage, of culture, of belonging to what has been Britain, the Britain of their fathers and grandfathers, is belittled at best or accused of hate crime at worst. Here's the thing, they and their kind, posturing as patriots, have betrayed these islands, dishonoured any ancestors who served, and sold the rest of us out to their paymasters, the elite. They betrayed us when they locked us in our homes. They've sold out those who love the homeland, who love family, and want little more than to raise that family in peace, with the freedom to aspire and make the best of themselves without the ceaseless interference of the state. Snow falls in Scotland in June on a planet said to be at boiling point, and the awakening wind blows cold, cold enough to have us open our eyes to the hypocrisy, as though hypocrisy was a big enough word to describe the behaviour of a dying animal so corrupted in its death throes that it dares to overlook the fact we will still be here with our heritage, our culture, our language and our faith long after they are gone. Joining me this evening is broadcaster, lawyer and futurist, I love that, futurist Andrew Eborn. Andrew, amongst much else, I spoke about D-Day. How did you feel watching our present crop of politicians posture as patriots?
Yeah, I felt very sad, and the reason I felt sad, we always say history repeats itself, and the reason history repeats itself, we don't learn the lessons from history. 80 years from D-Day, and you look at all the names and so on and so forth, rightfully being honoured and respected for what they've done. And we're on the verge of World War III at the moment, and the same thing can happen again. And it was Eagleman who pointed out, you effectively die 3 deaths. One is when your body gives up, the second is when you're put in the ground, and the third is that day when we cease to mention your name. And let us always hope that we never cease to mention your name, because behind all these statistics are real people. And this is my concern, is we're not learning those lessons. We're fighting wars in different places and so on and so forth. And the first casualty in war is always the truth.
It's the fact that, yes, to all of that, but it's also that it sounds just hollow script. You know, as I say, these are politicians who preside or take part in the diminishing of Britain and running down our history, running down so much of what it has been to be Britain. And they're working towards globalisation. You know, they're quite happy to see national sovereignty surrendered to the WHO, and yet we're supposed to take it seriously when they stand on hallowed ground like the beaches of Normandy and profess to want to defend Britain.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what I also find appalling. You're absolutely right. What I also find appalling is that it's politicised. So all the talk about today is not about respecting those who died. It's about Rishi left early. You know, they talk about that sort of stuff. So it's a political thing. Oh, what disrespect he showed to everybody because they're hoping they'll score a few more points in the polls. That's got to be wrong, hasn't it? And you're right, it sounds like hypocrisy. Standing there honouring the people who sacrificed their lives for a war they maybe didn't understand. And the shocking thing is looking at the ages of the people, you know, 18, 19, 20, they're kids on that sort of basis. And I think it's disrespectful, if you like, to politicise that sort of side.
I don't know how they can stand and do it. You know, Justin Trudeau is not ours. He's Canada's Prime Minister. But as I said, that spectacle of an ovation for an SS Nazi veteran and celebrating how he fought Russia. And then he casts his shadow on Juno Beach and mouths words about defending democracy. I don't know how they can do it.
As you say, the optics are wrong. But also, sometimes I think it's ignorance. Sometimes they don't necessarily know who they're standing in the room. We've had a video of Boris Johnson with various people, you remember, from Ukraine, and the people they called the neo-Nazis and so on and so forth. He's there holding up whatever it was, their T-shirt with the relevant
a flag with Nazi insignia.
Exactly. So you've got that sort of... And I sometimes say, and it's the same way as people chanting from the river to the sea, they sometimes don't necessarily know what they say. And in fact, some people have been interviewed on these marches and say, oh, which river, which sea, they don't know. And so you look at that sort of basis and they don't realise that for some people it means about genocidal intent and so on and so forth. So the difficulty, I think we're drowning in ignorance as well as other things. So it's not just about the optics, not just about politicisation of war and death. It is about that sort of ignorant side. And what people need to do is a bit more research so they realise exactly what they're doing.
It's the absence of credible, believable love of country. Yeah. If you're going to be Prime Minister, if you're going to be a frontbench politician, you would imagine that someone like that would be sincerely committed to Britain and what Britain has been and wanting to see Britain thrive.
No, you're absolutely right. And what it is, it's fear of upsetting people. You suddenly turn around and say, look, I'm really proud of Britain. All of a sudden, you're something phobic, or you're against this sort of stuff, you're anti-whatever. The reality is that people like Trump can get away with it. You say, make sort of America great again. You work on that basis. And they share the pride in the nation. We should be proud of Great Britain.
We should indeed. A break already. After that, we'll take a closer look into what's actually being uncovered by the Scottish COVID inquiry. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My first guest this evening is Bill Jolly, who has been a witness at the Scottish COVID inquiry, giving testimony. He's still awaiting answers after his father was discharged from hospital following a head injury and sent back to his care home with COVID in 2022 and later died. In 2020, I beg your pardon, and he later died. Bill joins me now. Hello, Bill. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, hello, Neil.
I think it would be really it would matter a great deal, I think, if you would describe what happened to your father in as much detail as you like, really.
Yeah, well, what happened to my father back in 2020 was he was in a care home in Aberdeen. He had a couple of falls that I didn't know about, but on the 11th of April 2020, he had two falls. He had a fall at 5 o'clock that evening where he banged his head on a toilet cistern, and the nurses at the time said, or the staff said, that it seemed to be okay. At 11 o'clock the same night, that's the 11th of April 2020, he had a more serious fall. He fell onto the back of his head and required to be blue lighted into Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. Now, the other thing I must point out is that my mum and dad sadly both had forms of dementia and they shared a room in the same care home. I then had to try and find out what was going on. At that time, we were right into the early stages of the pandemic, as it was called, and I had great difficulty trying to find out exactly what was going on. And also I had to deal with my mother, who was extremely anxious and confused because she had dementia, trying to find out what had happened to my dad. My dad had suddenly disappeared. Over the next couple of days, various horrendous things happened, which are, well, I did say in my testimony to the COVID inquiry. My father had a couple of falls, serious falls, in the care Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. And I was told he didn't qualify. I don't know what the qualification was, because there had been COVID in the care home before, the week before, but he was tested for COVID and found to be positive. Now, I wasn't aware of how bad my father's head injuries were and his body injuries until he was sent back to the care home. Now, I fought hard, for obvious reasons, to prevent my father being sent back to his care home because, for one thing, he was sharing a room with my mother. He had live COVID diagnosed at the hospital, and I was told by staff he was in a terrible state. He had serious head wounds, which had to be stitched. He'd ripped his elbows, he'd ripped his shoulder, his knees. He had been in reasonably good health before he went in. I was told he was now doubly incontinent, incoherent. He was very disorientated, and I fought hard, speaking to the staff at the hospital, to prevent my father being discharged back to the care home. I also fought hard with the care home manager at the time not to take my father back in the state I believed he was in. However, I was also told at this point that my power of attorney, which I did try and exert, had been removed. I was told that it was irrelevant, that they had special powers. To this day, I don't know what the special powers were, but they had special powers, and they would be sending my father back to where he lived, which was in the care home and with my mother. The next thing that happened was they intended sending my father back on the 13th of April, so it was within 3 days. And I tried to stop that, and I was told that it was under review. They were looking at medication. There was a problem with transport, and I had a very distressing night on the 13th. On the 14th, having not slept, I went out for a walk in the morning. I came back in at 9:10 in the morning to be told by my wife that my father was actually on his way back to the care home. I phoned the care home and I said, "You cannot possibly take my father back. I believe he's badly injured, in the care of the hospital. He's also got serious health problems now." And at that point, the manager did not intend isolating my father. The assumption would be that my mother would have COVID, and that was where he was going back to. I put severe pressure on them. I demanded an email or a text to say they would take responsibility for anything that happened to my mother. And they buckled at that point after speaking to an area manager, I believe, and my father was isolated in a small room in the upper floor, which I thought would at least protect my mother and maybe protect some of the people on the ground floor. I was sent a photograph, which I think I've supplied, of my father in the state he was in when he was released from hospital. And I was absolutely horrified. He looked like he'd been in a road accident, as you can see by his various head injuries, stitching, a severely swollen side of his head. And I was absolutely shocked. And I spoke to staff also in the intervening sort of 10 days, 12 days before he died, and his deterioration was massive. So he never really recovered from being in hospital, not so much the head wound he got in the care home, but he never recovered from the injuries, in my opinion, that he received in Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. And
Bill, were you given any explanation, given that obviously, I mean, it would appear evident to anyone how seriously unwell your father was. Were you given any explanation why there was this absolute urgency to get him back into the care home, out of the hospital and back into the care home? Was it explained to you why that had to happen?
I can quite frankly state this, and I said this in my statement, I was put in my place. If you can try and imagine a situation where we were all panicking, panic had been installed in all walks of life, and I was told that my father would have to be put out of hospital to make way for potentially an epidemic of healthier, younger people to get access. So it was almost like my father was, in my view, expendable. His life wasn't so important, and it happened,
Can I just? I have a statement from the care home in question saying, while we cannot comment on the circumstances of individuals who have resided within our care homes, furthermore, the care home added they followed all guidance from Public Health Scotland and legislation from the Scottish Government at every stage of the pandemic. How would you react to what certainly sounds like a fairly pro forma response?
Well, the big problem that I uncovered was that the hospital blamed the government. Initially, when I put in a formal complaint to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, they made out they were acting on instruction. So I take it that as from Nicola Sturgeon. I don't know if Jean Freeman was in place at that time, but that they had instructed the hospitals to do what they were doing. Interestingly enough, we did get eventually, after a lot of pressure, we did get a letter. I suppose you could say it was an apology, because it was the head of infectious diseases that we eventually got a meeting with, because I got a Dear John letter, is the best way to describe it at first, and I rejected it. I said, I'm sorry, I'm not accepting this. So my wife and I were invited in to meet a few members of staff. And it was admitted then that the wrong decision was made, that my father should not have been, and I don't know if that was based on his COVID, I believe it was based on his injuries, that they made the wrong decision, but the decision was made. And my father was put back into a care home that lost, I think, about 7 or 8 people out of 28 to COVID. Well, COVID on their death certificates.
Bill Jolly, I've run out of time with you, but I'm so grateful to you for bringing this testimony about just a single example there of what happened to a loved one in a care home, during that period. I'll be endeavouring to bring much more testimony from that inquiry into the light. But thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Okay, Neil, appreciate your help. Thank you.
We're going into another break, after which were do not resuscitate orders handed out during the pandemic unnecessarily? Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. We now continue talking about the findings, the testimony coming out of the Scottish COVID inquiry. I'm joined by former doctor, pharmaceuticals expert and barrister, Dr. Jonathan Engler, to ask about do not resuscitate orders and the way in which they were used during the pandemic. Was it unnecessary? Thanks so much, Dr. Engler, for coming in.
Thanks for having me on.
Give us a bit of a sense of the way in which these do not resuscitate orders were used and what they traditionally mean.
Well, the traditional meaning of a do not resuscitate order, or how many people interpret it, is that cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, won't be attempted when a person reaches a cardiac arrest. But as I think you've had John Campbell on here before, and as he says, and as is my memory of clinical medicine, is once a do not resuscitate order is applied to somebody, that colours the whole way in which that patient is treated. They're effectively seen as end of life, even though they may not be. So there are some quite draconian implications to having a DNR order applied. And of course, we heard in the Scottish inquiry how people were being phoned up by GPs saying, would you consent to having a do not resuscitate order applied? There were even instances where people had this applied where no conversation had been taken place, where it was in the notes at the end when they were discharged. They were surprised that that was applied. So there are some very, very serious questions to be asked.
Traditionally, if that's the right word, would it ever have been the case that someone who's healthy is asked to contemplate the arrival of circumstances wherein they would not be brought back to life? I would have thought a DNR would start to come in when somebody was so far gone, so ill in so many ways, that it would almost be a conversation and a process involving everyone else around that person.
Yeah, you would have thought so, but that seems to have been jettisoned during the COVID era. And I think the ethical justification for it is that we have to manage and maintain our resources for those people who are maybe got a greater chance of survival and so on. And this is a dangerous utilitarian slope, in my opinion.
Now, I think we do have we've got a clip of some of the proceedings relevant to this point about these so-called do not resuscitate orders.
My recollection is absolutely clear. There was discussions around age grouping for toe tagging. In other words, people over a certain age now, your normal attempts at resuscitation would be minimised, and as a consequence of the discussions, they were mentioning 70 and over initially.
I mean, in paragraph 28, you talk about rumours that the government, and I assume you mean the Scottish government, but I'd be grateful if you could clarify, had a plan to reduce that age group you were talking about to the over 50s.
Yeah.
Did that ever amount to more than rumour? I mean, as you'll appreciate, we're obviously looking at the Scottish government's strategic response.
It was absolutely in discussion, and they had a kind of 70, 60, 50 now escalating process.
Now, Andrew Eborn, also a legal mind, listening to Dr. Engler, listening to testimony like that from the inquiry, what's your human response?
Well, the human response is I'm shocked. I think the whole idea is that when you basically ask for informed consent, you have to lay out all of those consequences. That would make sense. If that didn't happen, then that's scandalous on that sort of basis. Because people don't realise what's going to happen as a result of that. You're basically treated as though it's end-of-life care, that it's a very different proposition. And again, the evidence will come out during the course of the inquiry. But if that is a headline, that's got to be wrong. It means you didn't have informed consent, which could give rise to all sorts of liabilities. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary, although when you say the evidence will come out during the inquiry, it is true, it is coming out as part of the Scottish inquiry, but this is basically a no-go area for just about every other official inquiry around the world. It is only in the Scottish inquiry that these matters are being aired openly and honestly. And I think that people want to believe that perhaps the reason for that is that this only happened in Scotland. But of course, that's actually not true, and I've looked into the worldwide evidence for this happening, and basically these practices were rife all over the world in spring 2020 and beyond, in fact. So to think that this is just a one-off incident is for the birds, really.
It feels as though, for the untrained eye, it feels as though the very health professionals upon whom we would depend for sober and serious contemplation of something as sacred, really, as a DNR, it was almost as though they were being barrelled along by the rest of the propaganda, or at least the publicity that was saying that what was coming at us was going to be overwhelming, and they were almost acting before it had happened by taking actions like these.
Well, of course, and in fact, what the result of some of these incidents would have been is that some people would have died, and people would have been surprised, possibly, that some people died, but that would have fed into a positive feedback loop in which people, including medical professionals and healthcare professionals, perceived this disease as much more deadly than it actually was. And then, of course, there would have been even more willingness to apply do not resuscitate orders and so on. So it's a positive feedback loop. And I think that a lot of people struggle with the idea that healthcare professionals can be involved in a series of actions which are ultimately harmful to the patient. But that historically there are many, many precedents for that. You don't have to go very far back to see medical professionals being involved. And there is a saying that, more harm was done to people by people that thought they were doing good than by people that thought they were doing evil. And to take one example from history, I'm sure some people know about the story of frontal lobotomy, but frontal lobotomy, the person who came up with the idea of frontal lobotomy, a Portuguese surgeon, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1949, and by 1949, 10,000 frontal lobotomies had been performed, and virtually every single one was left in a zombie-like state. So it shows you that it's not as black and white for people to say, well, doctors would never do that. Sometimes people get swept along. I mean, there are more recent examples of that, which are controversial. I have my own views on it, I'm sure you do as well, as gender reassignment surgery to children. I mean, some people would consider many cases of that to be effectively institutionalised abuse. And
to get back to the do not resuscitate orders, there's been testimony coming out of the inquiry saying that whole care homes, all residents, regardless of their actual circumstances, were issued with these orders in advance of them actually being ill, which again sounds like something that was snowballing down from on high and sweeping maybe care home staff along with it.
Yeah, and that's very shocking, and it's completely consistent with my own research into that area.
Well, it's scandalous, isn't it? I mean, it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're turning around to people and saying, there is no hope for you. As soon as something happens, well, we're not going to go any further. And as you say, if you're working on the basis that it's around the world, then sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need to call that out, get the evidence, because we're so reliant these days on experts, aren't we? And I think you have to question those experts.
Yeah, we do.
Dr. Engler, I almost don't know where to begin with this kind of testimony, but thank you so much for coming in and just beginning to enable us to properly to process what seems to have been going on during the last few years.
Thank you for having me on.
It's going to be an ongoing story, and I'll hope we can maybe look forward to further contributions from you. Thank you very much. Another break, here we go again. I will be joined after that by a GP with a slightly different take on the situation. Please don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. More from the Scottish COVID inquiry now. Here is a clip that features Adam Stakura, the head of policy and communications at Age Scotland, who said a man of 101 years of age was given a do not resuscitate notice during the pandemic because he was hard of hearing. Take a listen.
He was a 101-year-old veteran living in Glasgow, who one day got a knock at the door from paramedic and was handed a bit of paper, and they told him, just keep this by your bed. And he dutifully said, yes, of course. And she'd gone round to visit. This was later on in the year, and found it was a do not attempt resuscitation form. And under the reason for, it just said communication difficulties. And that's because he had hearing loss. And I think that in itself, there was no logic to this. And why you have to keep this by your bed. So if a paramedic, really chilling examples of how this is applied to people in quite a cavalier way at times. And of examples in care homes, where a whole care home would be sort of every single resident would have been issued or a DNR decision made in their name, as sort of a blanket decision, but with no real individual clinical assessment.
I'm joined now by Dr. David Lloyd, a general practitioner from North London. Thanks for joining us this evening, Dr. Lloyd.
Thank you.
What do you make
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. What do you make of that testimony that we just listened to there? You know, given what most of us would assume would be the absolute seriousness of the very idea of a do not resuscitate notice.
Golly, I mean, I could talk for ages and ages about this, so do tell me if I'm going to bore you. But I think people misconstrue what the DNAR is. It's a DNA CPR. So what we're talking about with patients is that if their heart stops, we won't try any artificial way of getting the heart going again. Now, most people think that by doing that, you're really saying that you're dooming that patient to die. But in fact, we're talking about a group that probably are going to die anyway. A successful resuscitation using CPR is really only successful in about 10% of the time, and that's when you're in hospital. If your heart stops when you're out of hospital, your chances of being resuscitated are incredibly low.
What about the idea, though, as Adam Stakura was testifying there at the inquiry of people being handed these notices in advance of any unwellness, and not just the 101-year-old veteran from Glasgow. He also testified about a 50-something lady who was apparently very fit, a runner, as a hobby, and she was contacted by her surgery and asked if she would take a DNA CPR notice because she too suffered a degree of hearing loss. How would you react to that?
Well, of course, we would all react with horror if that was the only reason. But don't forget, we were faced with the potential collapse of the health service with the COVID epidemic. Because we went into lockdown too late, we were having to fight fires all over the place. And yes, we did take terrible decisions during that time, where we had to try and work out those are the patients that might stand a chance if they got the best possible care in restricted circumstances or those who were inevitably going to die. And speaking as someone who ran a community COVID hub during those 2 years, those terrible 2 years, I found it was terribly difficult watching the patients that I would admit to hospital, knowing that a quarter of them would be dead by the end of the week. And so I found myself sometimes having to suggest to relatives that they say their goodbyes with me before they went into hospital because they wouldn't see their loved ones again. So we had to make some terribly difficult decisions faced with the enormity. We now know the most enormity is that 220,000 people died in this country from COVID.
Difficult decisions or wrong decisions. The very idea of thousands of people being contacted over the phone by GPs, surgeries, receptionists, people in good health with no particular being asked if they would, if it was okay with them if they had a DNA CPR notice lodged against them in the event of their becoming unwell at some point in the future. I mean, surely that's not just a difficult decision, but the wrong decision.
Well, can I push back? It wasn't receptionists. A lot of doctors spend an awful lot of time talking to an awful lot of patients about the decision about what they want to do about that. And research has shown that people like talking about DNA CPRs, particularly when they're coming to the end of their lives, and actually appreciate it. And in fact, I can actually quote some research here if you're interested. But a study done by the Medical Law Review, actually showed that more discussion took place during COVID than before COVID took place. So there was more logical discussion about end-of-life care during the COVID pandemic than there was before COVID actually started.
Hold that thought, please, Dr. Lloyd. Andrew Eborn, how do you react to what the doctor is saying there? You know, this idea that people were being just invited to contemplate the end, even before they were unwell.
I think there's a couple of points to make on this. Firstly, I absolutely believe that doctors wanted to try and do the best. I think that's the fundamental point. A couple of things the good doctor mentioned. They took terrible decisions, were the words that he talked about, and we would all act with horror if it was just communication difficulties. So the evidence will come out on that sort of bit. So the point I was making earlier about informed consent, and I'm sure the good doctor would turn around and say that if they weren't given all the circumstances, given all the necessary information, because the suggestion earlier on in the programme was that actually those who did consent to having this the do not resuscitate CPR were basically given worse treatment or not given proper treatment as a result of it. Again, the evidence will establish that. I'm not an expert in these sort of things, but I'd like to hear the doctor on that particular point. So if it was just communication difficulties, that we would all act with horror. That's a legitimate point. But secondly, did they get worse treatment as a result?
What about that? I'm really asking for your opinion, Dr. Lloyd. Does it not set people on a pathway to palliative care if it's in everybody's head that this person is being talked about in the context of a do not resuscitate order?
So again, I think we're concentrating on a very narrow aspect, which is the actual DNA CPR form. But what was much more difficult for us was this whole concept of ceiling of care, as we call it. So we would have to make decisions on every patient who was very ill in the hospital or very ill in the community. We have to do this all the time, is what level of care should we provide to this patient with this particular condition with the previous comorbids? And that's the really big discussion. DNA CPR is small fry compared to hearing about the terrible and very difficult and very complicated decisions that we all make about patients every day.
Thank you for your time this evening, Dr. David Lloyd. I'm just running out of time again. I don't know what a conversation that is that we have to cut short. Andrew Eborn, the very idea that people, as far as I'm concerned, were being written off in advance of being taken unwell and shown the exit door, before anything else. Out of time. Thanks for watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. I'll be talking to Adam Stakura in the second hour. You can catch that second hour with extended interviews over on GB News. Thank you, Andrew Eborn. Don't go away. Good evening and welcome to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show, where we've had a chance together to have a longer, more in-depth, more relaxed conversation with the guests. Tonight I'll continue my discussion about the Scottish COVID inquiry. I'll be asking whether do not resuscitate notifications were given out too readily. I'll be looking into China's secret billions, an attempt to buy the soul of Western universities. And joining me for the next hour is broadcaster, lawyer and futurist Andrew Eborn. As the Scottish COVID inquiry enters another week of evidence, we're hearing do not resuscitate orders were handed out to those with only minor ailments. To consider this, I'm joined now by health campaigner, author, semi-retired nurse, lecturer, educator, Dr. John Campbell, to discuss this in more detail. It's always lovely to see you, Dr. John Campbell.
You too, Neil. Thank you for having me back again.
Now, you saw many years of practice as a nurse. A DNR, a do not resuscitate notice, I would have imagined that was almost a sacred act where people were being invited to contemplate end of life. How do you process what seems to have been happening, certainly in Scotland, as is coming out at this inquiry?
Absolutely. We use do not resuscitate orders or do not attempt resuscitation orders, or sometimes it's do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It all basically means the same thing. And there can come a point where there's a cardiac arrest and the heart and the breathing stops. Now, in that situation, the only way you can get it going again is by resuscitating the patient, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, followed normally by sometimes drugs and sometimes defibrillation. This is how we get these patients back. And this is vital to be able to resuscitate patients who have got a reasonable chance of recovery. I think it's important to note, though, Neil, that sometimes CPR is inappropriate if we've got people with a terminal illness or people that are frail or people that have no real prospect of a meaningful life afterwards, because it is a fairly invasive, almost brutal procedure. So it's not always appropriate. So it's good to have these DNRs in some of the time. And we have used them, of course, for many decades now. But the key thing is they must always be done with the consent of the patient. The patient has to be entered into full discussion with the clinicians involved. Now, sometimes the patient can't be involved and the patient's relative or someone with power of attorney would be involved on the patient's behalf, acting on the patient's best interests. And normally there'd be a witness there as well. These are very serious documents. They need to be approached with great sensitivity, with great levels of empathy, and only used when there is no realistic chance of a normal life after a resuscitation attempt. If there's no DNR in place, then as healthcare providers, we are obliged to attempt resuscitation. That's why these can be important in the right situation. So there could be a patient with terminal cancer, for example, and if a do not resuscitate order is not in place and that patient did go into cardiac arrest, then as healthcare providers, we have to attempt resuscitation unless there is an order there. But it certainly seems in the COVID inquiry, these have been greatly overused. Now, I don't want to criticise Scotland or Scotland's healthcare providers here. In fact, I want to compliment Scotland immensely on this superb inquiry. Superb because it's hearing the views of ordinary people like you and me, ordinary relatives. The English inquiry seems to have been more esoteric. The councils in the COVID inquiry seem to be more empathetic and seem to be doing a really good job. And we're collecting a lot of information, but some of that is really quite concerning. One patient, for example, was asked 5 times in a day if he would sign a do not resuscitate order. This patient was only 38 years of age and considered inappropriate. General practitioners ringing up people out of the blue in different parts of Scotland at different times, not just in March and April 2020, but later on into 2020 this was happening. And the fact that it's happening in different places at different times makes you wonder if there's some sort of common stimulus of these phone calls, that this was being instigated in some way by higher authorities.
And surely one of the many problems with this is that once you have, for whatever reason and in whatever circumstances, a do not resuscitate notice is in the air, then that directly or implicitly affects the kind of care that's liable to be given to that person, doesn't it? Because you've raised the spectre that this person's on the way out.
Yes, and a lot of people in the COVID inquiry did say they felt like they'd been abandoned or left on the shelf, or they had various terms that meant much the same thing. Now, technically, if you've got a do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation order, it should just be that. It's cardiopulmonary resuscitation which should not be attempted. It should be quite specific. The problem is, and this is a common problem in my experience in healthcare and many people I've talked to, that when a DNR is in place, the philosophy of the care almost moves from attempting to cure the patient to get a full recovery and get them back out there into life to a more palliative sort of situation. So unfortunately, when someone's got a do not resuscitate order in place, that could well affect getting less dramatic treatments. For example, they might not be given oxygen as readily because people feel the care has gone on to palliative care. Technically, it's incorrect, but in practice, unfortunately, it does happen. And I really do feel there should be guidelines that are sent round from health authorities saying, look, do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation means just that and only that. All of the things should be negotiated with informed consent with the patient and with the relatives of that patient.
Andrew Eborn, it plays or it leads a person to make connections with stories we've covered here before about the use of midazolam and morphine. You know, it feels like there are pieces of a jigsaw that need to be assembled to see what the picture actually is, because some of the isolated pieces we have at the moment, they do seem to suggest a pattern of behaviour, especially in relation to care homes and the elderly.
Look, you're absolutely right, and I think, as I say, we've got more sunlight to basically look at this sort of situation. And Dr. John Campbell talks about procedure. What I would like to know is there an established procedure that everybody has to follow? Because then we can get all of the bits of evidence which we've heard in today's programme together, because it would be act with horror, as the doctor was saying earlier, if there was just communication difficulties. It would be terrible decisions. It would be chilling, as various other people have said, if a particular procedure is not followed. So what we need to look at is the particular evidence. What happened in various situations? To hear that one person in their 30s, I think you were saying, received a phone call 5 times is scandalous, isn't it?
Dr. John, what is this telling us about the bigger picture about the last 4 years? You know, you and I talk in regard to many aspects of this, and yet here we have, you know, fresh testimony coming out of the Scottish COVID inquiry, suggesting, frankly, that people were just being written off in advance. And there seems to be a cold-bloodedness yet that even though we're hearing this, I don't understand why more people aren't jumping up and down, demanding to know the how and the why of all of this.
You really wonder where the mainstream media coverage is on this, Neil. And I know on my videos I get hundreds, no, thousands of comments about relatives who are uncertain or feel that their relatives should have been given more active treatment and who have sadly left us. I think one of the big problems is that there was blanket treatments. Groups of people were treated the same, whereas healthcare should be completely individualised. All healthcare assessments should be bespoke. We should assess, plan, implement and evaluate care on an individualised basis, not on a blanket one-size-fits-all basis. Maybe that's one of the big things. And I don't want to make things look like things are worse in Scotland than anywhere else. I'm getting anecdotal reports on England that very similar things were happening. And I get reports from different countries that very similar things were happening. It's just that Scotland is illuminating this. And I think Scotland really needs to be congratulated for that.
It does feel, though, that there's a climate or an atmosphere in which human life was being treated casually, As you say, you'd expect a GP or a clinician to be looking into the eyes of the person in front of them and dealing them as a sacred or at least a valuable human being. And yet it seems that during COVID there was bigger decisions were being taken that were just lumping people together and treating them as dots on a spreadsheet, blips on a screen.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the sanctity of life, the sanctity of human life, there is something very special about human life. You know, when you're there when someone leaves this life, it's always a very, very special occasion. There's something special about human life. And I think we've tended to forget that. I think especially at the start of the pandemic, there was quite a lot of panic. So we had senior managers thinking, for various reasons, they should have been better informed, but thinking there was going to be mass casualties, thinking that there was going to be thousands of people requiring treatment all the time, and wondering about how they could ration that treatment out. And that was a mistake. This panic should have not been there. People should have taken the facts that were available to them. And senior managers, unlike us watching more from the outside or watching from junior positions, didn't have all this information. These people should have had the information and should have been able to make more rational decisions rather than blanket decisions, which appear like they've been based on rapid decision making rather than detailed, thought out decision making. But I couldn't agree more. The sanctity of human life is something special. We need to reflect on when human life begins and when human life ends, because whether it's before birth, during birth, or any time after birth up until a natural death, human life is special. And I would use the term sacred, yes.
Andrew Eborn, John speaks movingly there. As a healthcare professional who's been in the room on more than one occasion when somebody was crossing from life to death, and even in that moment, even as someone is leaving, there is something very vital, something very important, something sacred about that human life passing. Are the last 4 years turning a necessary light on something wider about us having, to some extent, lost that sense?
You're absolutely right. All life is sacred. And I think the reality is we're numbed by statistics. And we get desensitized, if you like, the more horrendous stories we get. It's all about numbers, as opposed to each of those numbers represents an individual. And if you look at that sort of side, which is why we need that clarity, and we deserve it. You had Bill on the programme earlier talking about he wanted clarity for his father. What happened? We need this evidence out there. So many scandals at the moment, from the post office scandal to the infected blood scandal, where these things take years. We have to learn the lessons from history, and those lessons dictate that we're entitled to information.
John, are you also hearing from fellow practitioners? I can only imagine that there are countless clinicians out there who saw this happening, nurses, doctors, who saw this sequence of events unfolding and must have been almost broken by it.
There's certainly a lot of stress has been generated, and there's certainly a lot of retrospection going on at the moment now. People aren't really very keen to talk openly about it. Most of the conversations I have are what you might call are on an informal basis. But there is all the information we need, if we just look at the Scottish COVID inquiry, to do really quite detailed studies on this. So we've got tens of thousands of words of first-hand testimony here. And this is very amenable to what we call a qualitative analysis. And you have to wonder where all the academics are. Why aren't we analysing this and generating themes? For example, generating themes like, was morphine and midazolam prescribed too early? Was it prescribed too readily? Were not for resuscitation orders prescribed on a blanket basis? All of these come out as a qualitative analysis from this huge amount of witness statements that we have. And from there, we could then go on and do much more quantitative analysis and get to definite facts. This research material is there. We need the researchers to go and do that so we can be much more definitive. And then individual practitioners can compare what they did and what they feel with what we find objectively from analysing this data. And we can make more informed decisions about how things were done in the pandemic. But you really have to wonder why this research is not being commissioned, because the data is sitting there just waiting for this form of analysis.
Dr. John Campbell, thank you so much. And I think I agree with you absolutely that it's greatly to the credit of the Scottish COVID inquiry that it is allowing people like you and me to give testimony, to talk about their loved ones and what's happened. And the fact that other inquiries elsewhere haven't been doing that is a great mistake. But Dr. John Campbell, we'll speak again, but thank you for this evening.
Thank you, Neil.
After the break, I'll be joined by a practising GP and author of a best-selling book, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, where we're continuing to contemplate, on the face of it, do not resuscitate notices raining down on healthy people in Scotland like confetti, but always open to alternative points of view. I'm joined now by practising GP and author of the best-selling book, The Great Cholesterol Con, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Kendrick.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on.
The testimony from Scotland, would you say ethics were followed when we've heard about healthy 50-year-olds being phoned up and asked if they'll take do not resuscitate notices, whole care homes apparently issuing blanket do not resuscitate orders to all residents? Would you be confident in that context that proper protocols and practices were adhered to?
Well, I think just take you back a little history of what DNAR forms or DNR forms are. They don't carry any legal status. They're really advisory, although an awful lot of people who work in the health service seem to treat them as though they were carved in stone and that they are legal. They were, in fact, at least in the healthcare community sector, was the fact that a number of elderly people who were very frail, very unwell, maybe suffering from severe dementia or terminal cancer, if they had a heart attack or a serious stroke, because they don't just cover heart attacks, they cover emergency care, they were having to be taken into hospital, and this was becoming very upsetting to the care homes, and also the ambulance crews were finding themselves dealing with situations where people who really should not be being resuscitated were. That's why these forms were created in the first place, really advisory and guidance, so that healthcare staff working in nursing homes when they had very frail, ill patients did not have to start trying to resuscitate them or send them into hospital. They're not signed by anyone except for an experienced doctor, and a doctor can override the decision whether somebody's being given resuscitation or not at any point. So if someone has a DNAR form, a doctor can come in and say, actually, I think we should be trying to resuscitate them, or vice versa. And there are new forms now called respect forms, which are basically contain the sort of wishes of people as to what they want happening. They're not also, sometimes the patient himself will say, I don't want to be resuscitated, and then the doctor may or may not decide to fill in one of these forms. So they're not these absolutely black or white things. There are no actual formal guidances on these areas. This is very much a decision made between an individual doctor and a patient. Now, speaking personally, do I think so that a care home cannot blanketly sort of cover everybody with the DNR forms? They don't have the authority to do that unless a doctor then comes along and says, yep, or actually does these things. So those statements cannot be true unless the GP in this case has said, yep, we're going to do DNAR forms on every single person. But really, you just wouldn't do these things without some background knowledge of the patient.
Certainly, on the face of it, it would certainly sound to a reasonable person, as you say, not the sort of thing that ought to be happening. But there's been testimony given at the Scottish COVID inquiry that suggests, at the very least, an allegation that care homes were issuing blanket DNR notices. Now, if we leave that hanging in the air, but even though setting all that to one side, does it reflect a mindset that was there in the care homes and elsewhere within the health profession going into COVID, that there were people who it was not going to be worth bothering with in advance of them even becoming ill?
Well, you'd never ever do a DNAR form on someone in advance of them becoming ill or unwell or very frail. That is that someone would have to be seriously unwell before anyone is going to sign a DNAR form. You don't go around.
But we have testimony from Age Concern Scotland saying that, for example, a fit and well 50-something woman, a runner, a fit and healthy 50-something, was contacted by her GP surgery to ask if she would accept a do not resuscitate notice. Is that not reflective of something troubling?
Well,
at least,
if that is the case, personally, I would never contemplate such a thing. That seems absolutely ridiculous if that is the case, because that's really not what happened. I mean, I was at one stage in a certain part of Cheshire the only GP who was going into care homes. A lot of them didn't, and I have my own thoughts on that issue. But we would definitely. So there was an issue sometimes of the care homes that is phoning up GPs and going, Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so who's very unwell and frail and probably would not survive. I mean, the other thing you have to take into account is community-based CPR has a survival rate of about 3%. And in the elderly and frail, it's much less than that. This is not casualty we're talking about where you jump up and down on someone's chest, defibrillate them and they come back to life. That's a very unusual situation. People can be left brain dead following with severe injuries, etc., etc. But you would not be. I find it almost. I do find the idea that you would phone up a fit and healthy 56-year-old and say, "Can we do a DNAR form?" You need to be pretty scary.
I can appreciate absolutely as a reasonable human being why you would say that. However, we also heard earlier of the case of a 38-year-old husband and father who was in hospital. He had been being treated for cancer, and he was asked 5 times over, I think, a 48-hour period if he would accept a do not resuscitate order. Now, he didn't want it. So in terms of informed consent, he was informed and he did not consent, and they kept coming at him. Surely there are clearly questions to ask.
Well, I agree the questions to be asked. The other thing to bear into mind is that, and then this may sound rather paternalistic, is it's actually not the decision of the patient. You can ask the patient. You don't have to ask the patient. It's actually a doctor decision as to whether or not they feel treatment is appropriate. However, if you were asked 5 times and said no 5 times, I think personally I would be very. I can't personally. I would never have done that. And I think the problem you got to remember is people were panicking. I don't believe pressure was put on from above, not directly. No one was said we must DNAR everything in sight because we're not going to be treating people, and that never happened that I'm aware of, and having spoken to other doctors. But yes, I think some and quite a lot of medical staff don't understand what a DNAR is and what it means. There is an issue here of education, definitely.
Dr. Kendrick, time is simply against me. But your bemusement and the extent to which you are troubled by, let's say, the testimony that is coming out of the Scottish COVID inquiry, I would say is interesting at the very least. Thank you, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. Okay. Andrew Eborn, just a final comment from you. Time's against us. Clearly, Dr. Kendrick there finding it hard to believe, which is fair enough, but we need evidence, we need more information.
It's totally down to the evidence. He said it'd be absolutely ridiculous, some of the evidence we've heard about, blanket sort of stuff. One of the things that concerned me when he says that they're basically advisory. So does that mean a patient could willingly consent, but still the doctors could override it? Now, that's an interesting point as well.
It is indeed. Another break, after which we'll be joined by Adam Stakura from Age Concern Scotland, who described to the Scottish COVID inquiry the plight of care home residents and said he heard of do not resuscitate paperwork being circulated to fit, healthy people before they were unwell. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. I'm joined now by Adam Stakura from Age Concern Scotland, who said he heard at the Scottish, he testified at the Scottish COVID inquiry about having heard many accounts of DNR, do not resuscitate notifications, being handed out in care homes over the smallest of illnesses. And Adam joins me now. Thanks for joining us, Adam.
Good to speak to you.
Adam, you used the word chilling in some of your testimony about what you were hearing from the people who were manning phone lines and listening to very worried people getting in touch to say that they had been consulted about DNRs. Can you elaborate on that thought for us?
Yeah, of course. I mean, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, our national helpline at Age Scotland was sort of set up to take huge numbers of calls, more than it normally would have, because of the severe risks to older people's health. The Scottish Government actually supported us to do that, to kind of be this kind of one-stop shop for people to get advice, because so many older people aren't online. But what we sort of found after the first few weeks of our enhanced sort of call capability was the fact that a lot of older people from in their sort of mid-50s and older, calling us up, inquiring as to why they've just received a phone call from their GP practice asking for them to agree to a do not attempt resuscitation decision should they become ill. Now, this for many was a bit like a bolt from the blue. They've never had a discussion from their GP or anyone else, any other clinician, about this issue. And I think the word chilling is my reflection on this from that period of time when callers to the helpline were feeling really anxious about this, wondering what on earth has it taken for these conversations to come our way, and indeed from our helpline advisors who never in their time in the charity had calls of this nature. So I think the panic and the anxiety from older people at the time was certainly palpable. And the longer the sort of the pandemic went on, we'd heard of more occasions upon which, whether it's GPs, clinicians, or others, were either discussing do not attempt resuscitation with older people the first time they've ever had, or indeed people finding do not attempt resuscitation decisions in their hospital discharge papers when they've been hospital for conditions completely unrelated to COVID-19.
And the fact that it was coming in from it wasn't isolated. These were not isolated instances. It was a trend that you identified. Did that suggest to you, or indeed anyone else, that it had to have been an order coming down from on high? That this wasn't just care homes and GP surgeries, acting independently and coming to this conclusion?
Well, it was quite remarkable, actually, in terms, as you say, these were inquiries coming from across the country. And in a very short space of time initially, sort of in a 2-week window, we managed sort of picking up, a real kind of trend across the country that people are asking about this and where on earth was this coming from. One of the things I will say, it's really hard to identify where this has come from. I think this is why we're so keen that the Scottish COVID inquiry investigated this, because our own investigations, indeed, when consulting with many other charities, it wasn't just Age Scotland, for instance, or older people, but charities that work with disabled people and people who are autistic, were finding the same thing happening, actually. And that's why we're incredibly keen that the inquiry is able to really dig down into the origin of this, the extent upon which it's happened, and actually trying to work out what has been the impact of do not attempt resuscitation decisions made out without people knowing about them.
And I mean, I've said before, and I'll say again, I mean, absolute fair play to the Scottish COVID inquiry. I mean, this is not having a go at Scotland or that inquiry, because it would appear uniquely at the moment it's bringing forth this kind of testimony. And with that in mind, with your contacts, so to speak, do you get the sense that this was a GB UK-wide policy that was going on, that people over 50, let's say, were being consulted in this way about accepting the idea of not being resuscitated in the event of illness?
We understand this was actually happening across the United Kingdom, and at some point, I think it might have been April 2020, there was a bit of paper that seemed to originate from a GP practice in Wales, actually, which sort of indicated that, you know, people might consider, you know, do not attempt resuscitation decisions. So it's clearly been happening across the country. Now, the reason I think the Scottish COVID inquiry is considering this, and absolute credit, I think, to John Swinney, who, I mean, the Scottish Government weren't particularly keen to have an independent Scottish inquiry to begin with, but as ourselves, Amnesty International, and a range of other charities, including news organisations like the Sunday Post, that were pushing for this, that in discussions with John Swinney, we were really keen as a charity to have do not attempt resuscitation being an identifiable line in the inquiry's remit, and that was accepted. And I think we and others had been really pushing the time between discovering this and when an inquiry was announced, looking for lots of different avenues for an investigation, and to the extent of this, whether it was, you know, writing to government ministers, consulting Scottish Parliament, committees to undertake investigations, looking at organisations such as Healthcare Improvement Scotland, who may be able to identify origin, scale, and indeed impact. So we've been on a dogged kind of battle to find out more about this. But I think there's no doubt that this is issues that affect people from across the United Kingdom. And there were times a few years ago when I would receive phone calls from people in England who had either heard us on the telly or watched on the telly or heard us on the radio or indeed in newspapers talking about the issue, saying, this has happened to me, this happened to my family too. So I think what we don't know is that extent of this and its impact, and that's why it's so important to get to the bottom of it.
Adam, I have to say, this sounds to me like a national scandal. I cannot believe that this story that you have to tell is unfolding without this surely leading to significant consequences about such a course of action.
I mean, I think, I've said before, it felt chilling. It made me feel really angry at the time, and the testimony we'd hear from people about the impact on them is something that still kind of sticks with me and us as a charity. I think, again, we've got to go back to this point about really trying to understand what has happened, what the implications have been for people. And I think that's why this inquiry, and indeed there'll be other instances for investigation, I'm very sure, really does kind of get to grips with this. And I think part of this is about how you change things in the future. What's incredibly clear about this is that the public awareness of things like do not attempt resuscitation is really low, and the clinicians themselves, I think, have been open enough to admit they've not been particularly good at having conversations with people about these kind of anticipatory care planning, your kind of end-of-life choices, you know, at times out with the kind of COVID crisis. So there's certainly a lot to learn from this. And I think what we'll find out, whether it's a scandal or not, will really depend on all the evidence that's given and the conclusion of this inquiry. I know discussing this early on in the pandemic with the Scottish Government, they were adamant that they had not issued any kind of instruction.
I'd just like to bring, Adam, I'd just like to bring in my studio guest here, Andrew Eborn, who's I think also interested in in having the benefit of talking to you. Andrew, is scandal?
Well, it definitely is a scandal, and I think what we need to work out is the evidence, because we've heard Dr. David Lloyd said very specifically we would all act with horror if the only reason put down were communication difficulties. Well, that's a question of fact, isn't it? So we need to see the evidence on that basis. Dr. David Lloyd also said, if I understand rightly, that there weren't receptionists making these phone calls. Well, again, that's down to evidence. But I'm with Adam on this one. The evidence that I've heard tonight in today's programme is chilling. and it raises all sorts of questions. I would like to know what the process is. It sounds to me, based on what I've heard, that there hasn't been informed consent in all cases, in which case that's not just a local scandal, not just a national scandal, but an international one, and we need to look at that.
Adam Sakura, just a final comment from you, really. Are you content that the evidence is there? Andrew raised the issue of whether or not it was, the surgeries, receptionists phoning people or not. That it was being handled in a way that would appear so casual. Are you confident that the evidence is there, that this is indeed what was happening across the country?
Well, I think the evidence is there. From our point of view, things we've heard from members of the public about who is making phone calls to them and maybe how they've found these decisions. Of course, these things are dealt with by clinicians, so administrative staff and GP surgeons really shouldn't be doing this. But we've got to remember as well that you don't need to consent to such a thing. A clinician, a doctor can decide themselves, but the best practice has been to have the conversation, an informed conversation about this, because at any time you might find yourself presented to a clinician in an emergency situation and they're not going to resuscitate you. But the real thing here is not about so much the DNAR, but what is the implication of having such a thing in your name? And quite frankly, how many people are unaware that they might have a DNAR decision in their name, in their medical records, as we found people leaving hospital with these in their discharge papers. So there's a lot to uncover. And I think we really want to find out, origin, impact, and the scale of this.
Adam Stakura from Age Concern Scotland. I honestly, genuinely cannot think of a more important story, literally a matter of life and death for people up and down the country. Thank you very much for bringing it to our attention this evening. After the break, we'll be asking if China has secret billions to spend buying the soul of Western universities. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. In a 2019 speech, the internet pioneer Peter Thiel worried about possible high-level infiltration of American companies and universities by China. Now, 5 years later, it seems that his worries have been more than justified. Joining me to discuss this is Assistant Professor of International Relations at Webster Vienna Private University, Ralph Schulhammer. I'm always encouraged by the very sight of you, Ralph, for I know the insight is coming. Good to see you.
I can only return the compliment. Great to be on with you, Neil. Good to hear you and good to see you.
This is interesting to say the least. I remember allegations of the sort that are being attributed to Peter Thiel, regarding the buying up of academia. Can you enlighten us further?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Chinese are very smart, right? By the way, so are many other nations. And they have understood something that very often eludes us in the West, that if you want to influence Western politics, it is the elites you have to buy off, not, the working class or the masses, so to speak. And to give you one example, because I think a lot of your themes today correctly, and I'm glad you touched on this topic, is about COVID. But remember just a couple of years back when there were the first rumors that maybe this came from a lab in Wuhan, that maybe actually American funding ran into this lab. So all these connections were there. But of course, a lot of the people that should have known better, a lot of the academic elite in the United States, they were, whether it was ill-intended is a separate question, but they were economically, financially depending on China. So they had an inclination to immediately say, oh, no, a lab leak, that can't be true. That must be a conspiracy. That's all BS, and it's absolutely impossible. And the Chinese know this very well. If you buy influence, if you buy good PR, it is the universities you go to and not any other source.
There does seem to be, in the context of a story like this one, it's often dismissed as conspiracy theory to say that there's a sort of a blurring of national identities. To whom are people loyal? Are they loyal to the homeland or a homeland, or is there some kind of international intrigue? Is this suggestive of people who don't know whose side they should be on?
I think a little bit, but I would also say I agree with what you said, but I think this has always been at the heart of politics. The Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis, right? They all understand, and other countries as well, that in order to act as a successful state, you need a certain level of internal cohesion. So when they look at the West, right, when they look at what's going on in our societies, of course they will try to take advantage of the divisions that run through British society, through German society, through Austrian society. That's just a strategic, smart thing to do. Honestly, I would do the same thing. What is so intriguing about all of this is, of course, they are not, this is very important to think about this. They are not creating those divisions. They're exploiting them. And I want to give you a very quick example, because a couple of days ago, still currently, right, we had the memories of D-Day, right? I think one of the, in my opinion at least, and I think I can say this because my ancestors were on the other side of this event, but one of the most shining moments in British history. And then you have the British Prime Minister, who apparently originally didn't even want to go to France to commemorate the landing in Normandy. And now he left earlier, and he's apparently now doing an apology tour. And that shows you the kind of detachment of the political class from the things that are important to the people, and that people, for good reasons, take pride in. And this is something that they exploit because they understand that the kind of unhealthy relationship we in the West have with our past is a burden for the future. If you do not identify, if you don't have a strong loyalty to your country and its history, then of course you're much less willing to defend your country in the future. And you see this, by the way, in every poll that they take about, would British people be willing to defend Britain in case of an invasion? I think Unheard did a very big poll just a couple of days ago, and the numbers are shocking, right? Not even half of the British would be willing to defend their country with weapons in hand. And the same, by the way, is true in continental Europe. And this is, of course, a huge asset if you're in a global competition and if you're China or any other country. So again, I'm not saying, to be very clear, what the Chinese are doing is what any other country that acts rational would do as well. If I can weaken my enemy internally, I might defeat them without ever going to war. And that is the best situation I can find myself in.
Andrew Eborn, we really are, from the sounds of it, reaping the whirlwind of a generational attempt to apologise on a global scale for our own histories, for our identity, for our pasts. And generations, maybe multiple generations of youngsters have come through being inculcated with this negativity.
Yeah.
And is that at the root of what we're seeing and what Ralph's describing? That late in the day for people to, like Rishi Sunak and the rest of them, to suggest that we have to demonstrate pride in country, one day a year on the, on the anniversary of D-Day. It's too little, too late.
It's far too little, too late. And there's that sort of history is ugly, is the honest answer. It's ugly for every single nation. But what we shouldn't do is lose our national sense of pride in what we are and what we stand for. It's the point I made earlier about in America, they celebrate Make America Great Again. We should make Great Britain great again and work on that sort of premise.
Ralph, I'm minded of the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin of Russia, and how he began his answer to Tucker Carlson's first question with a 30-minute history lesson about Russia, where he either genuinely felt or was at least able to give the impression that he cared deeply about Russian history and Russian values. And one also gets the sense from China and Xi that they can at least give the impression of a deep-rooted sense of nationhood and the homeland, and that's sadly lacking here in Western Europe, in Britain. And as you rightly say, why wouldn't proud, confident countries exploit the negativity and the lack of pride that we so blatantly advertise?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And to put it on even, let's say, in simpler terms, you cannot have a nation state without a national identity. I think, these two things are very tightly connected. And I completely agree with you. Whatever one thinks, and this bothers me, and I know, Neil, that you have experienced this many times in the past. One is not, in the pockets of the Chinese or Putin apologists. If one points out that in Moscow, in Beijing, right, that they think in historical terms, that they see Russia, that they see China of something that is bigger than the individual, right, that reaches back in history and for them, ideally, will also reach further into the future. And then you have somebody like Rishi Sunak, who I'm sure is personally a nice guy, but I'm wondering if his mind, I think he's already, I don't know what precisely his new job is going to be, but I think he's already checking out apartments in New York after the elections in July. I don't have the sense, and this, by the way, goes for all of the Tories, in my opinion. I'm sad to say I'm a foreigner, so I mean no disrespect to your British audience, but I really have the impression that there's a significant number, at least of the leadership of the Tory party. They don't know what to do with a sense of patriotism, with a sense of nationalism, with a sense of national pride. I know sometimes these terms make us queasy, but they shouldn't, because let's be very honest here. As your guest correctly pointed out, there are dark spots in every nation's history. Believe me, I'm Austro-German. I know plenty about dark spots in our history. But the British pretty much stood on the right side of history whenever it counted. From slavery to the Second World War, as I said, as an Austro-German with the First World War, I take a somewhat different sense. But overall, I think the world was better off because the British played a leading role in human history, and that is something to be proud of. Just as the Chinese are proud of their history, which they shall be, just as the Muslim world is proud of its history, which they shall be, right? This is all fine. We are the only civilization, Western civilization, that constantly thinks you have to feel bad if you take pride in your own history. By the way, nobody outside of Europe understands this, or outside of the West. It's completely absurd. It's like an autoimmune disease that we have, that every time there's something to take pride in, we immediately say, no, but actually we are really, really bad. No, we are not, is it? There are dark spots, there are light spots, but it's completely natural to believe in one's country.
A national and a cultural autoimmune disease. What a perfect way of describing the predicament in which we find ourselves. Once again, as I knew in advance, I've been enlightened once more by Ralph Schulhammer. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll speak soon.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you for watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. We will be back next week.